London, 1814. The crush of the season was at its peak in Lady Harrington's ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles, expensive perfume, and the desperate ambition of 100 matchmaking mamas. Julian Trevane, the Marquis of St. Ives and heir to the Duchy of Cornwall, stood on the periphery of the dance floor, his expression one of practiced boredom. At 32, Julian was considered the season's most elusive prize. He was wealthy and devastatingly handsome with his dark curls and brooding eyes, and possessed a cynicism so profound it acted as a shield against the society he loathed. He watched the debutantes twirl in their pastel silks, seeing not potential brides, but transactions. Stifling, isn't it? A voice murmured nearby. Lord Stanton, a friend from his Oxford days, swirled his brandy. I hear Lady Mary has her sights on you tonight. She's wearing blue, your favorite color, or so the gossip columns claim. The gossip columns claim my favorite color is blue because I once wore a sapphire pin, Julian replied dryly. In truth, I prefer the gray of a storm cloud. It warns you to seek shelter. Unable to bear another moment of the calculated flirtations, Julian slipped through the French doors onto the terrace. The night air was cool, a welcome reprieve from the stifling heat of the ballroom. He inhaled deeply, expecting solitude. He was not alone. In the shadowed alcove at the far end of the terrace, a woman was kneeling. She was not crying, as he might have expected of a wallflower escaping the festivities. Instead, she was furiously working with a needle and thread, the hem of a ripped gown bunched in her hands. Julian stepped closer, his footsteps silent on the stone. The woman was illuminated only by the spill of light from the ballroom. She wore a dress of simple dove-gray silk, at least 2 seasons out of fashion, and her chestnut hair was pulled back in a severe knot that did nothing to soften her features. Yet, as she bit off the thread and smoothed the fabric, he noticed the curve of her neck and the determined set of her jaw. A clandestine operation? Julian asked, stepping into the light. The woman jumped, dropping the hem. She looked up, her eyes wide. They were the color of warm honey, startled and fiercely intelligent. "Forgive me, my lord," she said, scrambling to stand. "I didn't think anyone would come out here." "I was escaping," Julian said, moving to the stone balustrade. "I assume you are doing the same, though most escapees do not bring sewing kits." "I am not escaping," she corrected him, her voice soft but steady. Miss Emily Vane tore her hem on a potted palm. She was terrified her mother would scold her for clumsiness, so I offered to mend it before the next set. Julian raised an eyebrow. "You are mending a rival's dress." "A rival?" She let out a short, quiet laugh. "Hardly. I am Clara Thorne, my lord. I am 23, dowerless, and entirely invisible. I have no rivals because I am not in the race." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a decade. Julian found himself stepping closer. "Clara Thorne, a name I do not know. And yet, you are here, at Lady Harrington's." "My aunt is Lady Harrington's godmother," Clara explained, tucking her needle into a small velvet pouch. "I'm tolerated for the sake of family connection, provided I do not take up too much space." "And so you hide in the shadows, fixing the mistakes of others." "Someone has to," she said simply. She looked at him then, really looked at him, without the simpering hunger he was used to. "You are St. Ives, aren't you? The one everyone is terrified of." "Am I terrifying?" "You look." She tilted her head, studying him. "You look lonely, but you wear it like armor, so no one will notice." Julian felt a jolt in his chest, a strange, electric connection that left him momentarily breathless. Before he could respond, the terrace doors opened, and a giggling group of young women spilled out. "I must go," Clara whispered. "Emily will be waiting for her dress." She brushed past him, her gray silk rustling against his leg. For a moment, the scent of lavender and rain lingered in the air. Julian stood alone on the balcony, staring at the spot where she had stood, feeling a spark of something dangerous ignite in his chest. The following morning, the spark was extinguished by a bucket of ice-cold reality. Julian stood in the study of Greyston House, facing his grandfather, the Duke of Cornwall. The old man sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face lined with pain but his eyes as hard as flint. "I am dying, Julian," the Duke said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You have been dying for 10 years, grandfather," Julian replied, leaning against the mantel. "You are too stubborn to actually do it. This time is different. Dr. Morris gives me 6 months." The Duke slammed his cane onto the floor. "And I will not leave this earth with a succession unsecured. You have played the rake long enough. You need a wife. A sensible one, not one of these flighty peacocks you dance with." "I am not currently looking for a wife," Julian said coldly. "Then it is fortunate I have found one for you." The Duke slid a piece of parchment across the desk. "The daughter of my old regiment friend, Colonel Thorne. He died penniless 2 years ago, leaving the family in ruin. I have arranged to pay their debts. In exchange, you will marry the girl." Julian froze. He picked up the paper. Miss Clara Thorne. The memory of the terrace, the honey eyes, the quiet honesty, the "I am invisible" flashed through his mind. And then, the cynicism crashed down. She knew. The thought was a physical blow. Of course, she knew who he was. She said it herself. "You are St. Ives." That performance on the balcony, the mending, the humility, the "I am not in the race," it was all a game. She must have known the Duke was maneuvering this, and she had positioned herself perfectly to catch the heir's interest just hours before the trap was sprung. "She is desperate," the Duke said, mistaking Julian's silence for hesitation. "And desperate women make obedient wives. The wedding is in 3 days." 3 days. Julian crushed the paper in his fist. "And if I refuse?" "Then I cut the entail," the Duke snarled. "You get the title, yes, but the money, the unentailed estates, the investments, everything that actually keeps the roof of St. Ives Castle from collapsing, goes to the crown. You will be a pauper Duke." Julian looked at the fire, his jaw tightening until it ached. He had been played. By his grandfather and by the girl with the lavender scent. "Fine," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I will marry her, but do not expect me to love her." The wedding of Julian Trevane and Clara Thorne was a somber affair, devoid of the joy that typically marks such occasions. It took place in a small, drafty chapel on the outskirts of London. There were no guests, only the Duke of Cornwall, sitting in a wheelchair like a grim sentinel, and Clara's mother, a fragile woman who wept silently into a handkerchief. Tears of relief, Julian assumed, that her financial salvation was secured. Clara stood at the altar, her hands trembling slightly in her new white gloves. She dared a glance at Julian. He looked magnificent in his formal black coat, but his face was carved from granite. He had not spoken a word to her since arriving at the chapel, not even a greeting. The man who had shared a moment of vulnerability on the terrace had vanished, replaced by the terrifying Marquis society spoke of. "I do," Julian said when prompted, the words sounding more like a sentence than a vow. "I do," Clara whispered, her heart heavy in her chest. She had tried to speak to him the day before, when he had come to her parents' rented rooms to sign the settlements. She wanted to tell him that she had no part in the Duke's ultimatum, that she was doing this only because her father's creditors were threatening debtors' prison. But Julian had looked at her with such cold disdain that the words had died in her throat. "You have what you wanted," he had said then, signing the papers with a flourish. "Let us hope it is worth the price." Now, as the priest pronounced them man and wife, Julian did not kiss her. He merely offered her his arm, stiff and unyielding, to lead her out of the church. "The carriage is waiting," he said abruptly. "We'll leave for Cornwall immediately." "Cornwall?" Clara faltered. "But I have not packed my trunk fully, and I thought we might stay in London for the—" "I have no desire to parade my purchase before the ton," Julian cut her off. "My grandfather returns to his estates to die. We go with him." The journey to Cornwall took 4 days. They were the longest 4 days of Clara's life. They traveled in the Duke's luxurious coach, but the atmosphere inside was suffocating. The old Duke slept most of the way, leaving Clara and Julian sitting opposite each other in tense silence. Clara watched the landscape change from the manicured hedgerows of the home counties to the wild, rugged moors of the west. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl against the carriage windows. It reflected her own turmoil. She was now a marchioness, the future Duchess of Cornwall, yet she felt like a prisoner. When they finally crested the hill overlooking the estate, Clara gasped. Fencerow Castle rose from the cliffs like a beast of black stone, battered by the Atlantic Ocean crashing below. It was magnificent, ancient, and utterly forbidding. "Welcome home," Julian said, his voice laced with irony. "I hope you like draughts and isolation, Lady St. Ives. It is a far cry from Lady Harrington's ballroom." "It is beautiful," Clara said softly, meaning it. There was a raw power to the place that called to her. Julian ignored her. As the carriage clattered into the courtyard, a line of servants stood shivering in the wind. Julian leaped out before the footman could even lower the steps. He helped his grandfather down with surprising gentleness, then turned to Clara. He did not lift her down. He merely held out a gloved hand. "Mrs. Prendergast will show you to your rooms," he said as she stepped onto the cobblestones. "I have business to attend to with the steward. Do not wait for dinner for me." "Julian," Clara said, reaching for his sleeve. "Please, we have only just arrived. Can we not?" He pulled his arm away as if she had burned him. "We have an agreement, madam. You have my name and my money for your family. I have the heir my grandfather requires. That is the extent of our union. Do not ask for more." He turned on his heel and strode into the dark moor of the castle, leaving Clara standing alone in the wind, the salt spray stinging her eyes. Mrs. Prendergast, a stained woman with a ring of keys at her waist, stepped forward. "My lady, if you follow me." Clara took a deep breath, smoothing her travel-wrinkled skirts. She thought of her sisters, safe now from poverty. She thought of her parents, their debts paid. She straightened her spine. "Lead the way, Mrs. Prendergast," Clara said, lifting her chin. "I should like to see the kitchens first. I suspect this castle needs a great deal of work, and I intend to start immediately." Julian might have thought he acquired a piece of furniture, silent and decorative. He was about to discover that Clara Thorne did not break easily. If this cold stone fortress was to be her prison, she would turn it into a home, with or without his permission. November descended on the Cornish coast with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The wind screaming off the Atlantic battered the stone walls of Pencarrow Castle day and night, a constant, howling reminder of their isolation. For the first fortnight, Julian had expected his new wife to crumble. He had seen London ladies wilt in the face of a missed tea time. Surely, a draughty, understaffed fortress on the edge of the world would break Clara Thorne's spirit within a week. He expected tears, complaints, and perhaps a plea to return to the comforts of Mayfair. He stayed away from the main house as much as possible, riding the boundaries of the estate, immersing himself in ledgers, and waiting for the inevitable tantrum. It never came. Instead, a strange and unsettling transformation began to take root within Pencaro. It started small. One evening, Julian returned from the mines, soaked to the bone and shivering, expecting the usual lukewarm mutton and a cold hearth in the dining room. Instead, a roaring fire crackled in the grate, casting a golden glow over the polished wood. The table was set not with the chipped crockery he had grown used to, but with the heavy silver service that had been locked in the vaults for 20 years. The food was hot, a rich stew with fresh bread, and the servants, usually sullen and ghost-like, moved with a new, brisk purpose. "Mrs. Pendergast," Julian said, pausing as the housekeeper poured his wine, "has the staff suddenly decided to earn their wages?" Mrs. Pendergast, a woman who smiled as often as a tombstone, actually softened. "It is her ladyship, my lord. She's been in the kitchen since dawn. Showed the scullery maid how to properly seal the larder against the damp. And she insisted the fires be lit in the east wing an hour before your return." Julian frowned, staring at the empty chair opposite him. Clara had retired early, as she often did, avoiding the awkward silence of their shared meals. Did she? The following week, the changes grew bolder. The rotting velvet curtains in the library were taken down, mended, and rehung. The layers of dust that had coated the portraits of his ancestors were wiped away. The castle, which had felt like a dying animal for a decade, was beginning to breathe again. It irritated him. It irritated him because it did not fit the narrative he had constructed. A fortune hunter does not spend her days cataloging linen or debating the price of coal with a housekeeper. A manipulator does not kneel in the garden in the biting wind, trying to salvage the neglected rose bushes. He decided to confront her. He found her one afternoon in the estate office, a room he considered his sanctuary. She was standing at the tall desk, a ledger open before her, ink smudging her fingers. "What are you doing?" Julian demanded, striding into the room. "The estate accounts are not your concern." Clara looked up, not with fear, but with that maddeningly calm gaze of hers. "They are if the estate is bleeding money, my lord. I am perfectly capable of managing my own finances." "Are you?" She turned the ledger toward him. "Because, according to this, the tenant farms in the lower valley have not paid rent in 3 months. And yet, the expenditure for their repairs has tripled. They are struggling," Julian said defensively. "The harvest was poor. I am not a tyrant, Clara. I do not evict families because of bad weather." "I did not say you were a tyrant," she said softly. "But you are being swindled by your overseer. Look." She pointed a slender finger at a column of figures. "He claims to have purchased slate for the roofs of the widow Gurney's cottage. But I visited Mrs. Gurney yesterday. Her roof is still thatched and leaking." Julian stayed at the numbers. He looked at Clara. "You visited the tenants." "I introduced myself. I am their mistress now. Am I not? They should know my face." She closed the book. "I took the liberty of dismissing the overseer this morning. Mrs. Gurney's son will take the position. He is honest, and he knows the land." Julian felt the wind knocked out of him. He had spent weeks assuming she was plotting to spend his fortune on silks and jewels. Instead, she was saving it. She was protecting his people. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why do you care? You have what you wanted. You are a marchioness." Clara stepped around the desk, stopping just inches from him. For the first time, he saw a crack in her composure. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Because this is my home now, Julian," she whispered. "And because I am not the villain you have decided I am. I did not trap you. I did not ask for this. But since we are both here, bound by your grandfather's will, I intend to make this life bearable. I only wish." She hesitated. "You wish what?" "I wish you would see me," she said. "Not the shadow of your resentment. Just me." She brushed past him, leaving the scent of lavender in the stale air of the office. Julian stood there for a long time, staring at the closed ledger, the armor around his heart developing a hairline fracture. The thaw began slowly after that. Julian stopped taking his meals in silence. He began to ask her opinions on the estate, tentatively at first, then with genuine interest. He discovered she had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that matched his own. One evening, as a storm raged outside, They sat in the library. Julian was reading, but his eyes kept drifting to Clara, who was sketching by the fire. The firelight danced in her hair, turning the chestnut to copper. She looked peaceful, beautiful. "Clara," he said. She looked up, her pen pausing. "Yes. The stew at dinner. It was excellent." A small, genuine smile curved her lips. It transformed her face, making her look younger and softer. "I shall tell Mrs. Pendergast, though I suspect she added extra rosemary just to spite me. We have a running wager on whether you will notice the herbs." "I notice," Julian said, holding her gaze. "I notice a great deal lately." The air between them charged, heavy with unspoken words. Julian set his book down. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to apologize for the coldness of their wedding day. He wanted to know if the woman who mended dresses on balconies could ever learn to care for a man who had treated her like an enemy. He stood up. Clara stood too, her breath hitching. "Julian," she breathed. Just as he took a step toward her, the heavy oak doors of the library were thrown open. Mrs. Pendergast stood there, looking flustered, an expression Julian had never seen on her face. "My lord," she stammered. "A carriage has arrived. In this weather." Julian frowned. "Who would be foolish enough to travel in a gale?" "It is." Mrs. Pendergast stepped aside. A figure swept into the room, bringing with her a gust of cold air and the overpowering scent of expensive French rosewater. She threw back the hood of her velvet traveling cloak, revealing a cascade of golden blonde hair and a face of perfect, porcelain beauty. "Lady Isabella." Julian stiffened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Julian, darling!" Isabella cried, rushing forward with a sob that sounded entirely too practiced. She stopped just short of embracing him, her blue eyes wide and glistening. "Oh, thank heavens I made it. The road was treacherous." "Isabella," Julian said, his voice ice. "What are you doing here?" "I heard the news," she said, clutching her chest. "About the Duke. That he is fading fast. You know how dear he was to my father. I could not bear the thought of him passing without saying goodbye." She turned then, her gaze landing on Clara. The mask of distress slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of sharp, assessing malice, before the smile returned. "And this must be the new Lady St. Ives," Isabella said, extending a gloved hand that looked more like a claw. "How quaint! To meet the woman who finally ensnared the Wolf of Cornwall." Clara stood tall, though Julian saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped her sketchbook. She sensed the danger immediately. This was the woman society had expected Julian to marry. The woman who belonged in this castle, with her gold hair and confident beauty, was far more than a plain wallflower ever could be. "Lady Isabella," Clara said quietly, "you are welcome to Pencarrow." "Oh, I know," Isabella purred, turning her back on Clara to look up at Julian. "I have always felt so at home here. Haven't I, Julian?" Julian looked from the woman who had once tempted him with her beauty to the woman who was currently saving his home with her grit. He saw the hurt in Clara's eyes, the way she retreated half a step into the shadows. The fracture in his heart widened, but this time, fear seeped in. Fear that the fragile trust he had just begun to build with his wife was about to be shattered by the ghosts of his past. "Mrs. Pendergast," Julian said sharply, "prepare the blue room for Lady Isabella. She stays one night only." Isabella's smile didn't waver. "One night is all I need, darling," she murmured, too low for Clara to hear. But Clara heard, and as she watched her husband stare at the beautiful intruder, the coldness of the castle seeped back into her bones. Dinner that evening was a battlefield, though the weapons were crystal goblets and veiled insults rather than swords. The dining hall at Pencarrow, which Clara had worked so hard to make welcoming, now felt like a stage set for a tragedy. Lady Isabella sat at Julian's right hand, resplendent in crimson silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. Beside her, Clara felt colorless in her lavender muslin, the very same dress she had worn the night she met Julian on the balcony, a sentimental choice she now bitterly regretted. "Do you remember the masquerade at Lord Pearson's?" Isabella asked, leaning toward Julian, her bare shoulder brushing his sleeve. You went as a corsair. I have never seen a man look so devastatingly wicked. Half the women in the room swooned. Julian took a long sip of wine. I remember the champagne was warm and the music was off-key. Oh, you are always so cynical, Isabella laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on Clara's nerves. She turned her gaze to Clara, her eyes narrowing slightly. And you, Lady St. Ives, did you attend Lord Pearson's? No, I suppose not. The invitation list was quite exclusive. I was in the country that year, Clara said evenly, refusing to look down at her plate. Tending to my father. How noble, Isabella murmured, making the words sound like dull. Julian has always needed excitement, haven't you? Darling, he needs a partner who can match his fire. I do wonder how he manages with domesticity. Clara looked at Julian, hoping for a defense, a shared glance, or anything to acknowledge the bond they had begun to forge in the library. But Julian was staring into his glass, his expression unreadable. The presence of Isabella seemed to have dragged him back in time, reminding him of the glittering, superficial world he claimed to hate but understood so well. Clara was the outsider here. After dinner, Isabella cornered Julian in the hallway as Clara went to check on the Duke. Clara paused at the top of the stairs, the sound of her own name drifting up from the shadows below. She is quaint, Julian. Isabella's voice was low and seductive. But let us be honest. She is a mouse, and you are a wolf. How long before you devour her? Be careful, Isabella. Julian's voice was a low warning. She is my wife. Is she? Or is she just a bill of sale? Isabella sighed. I only worry for you. I hear whispers, you know, even in London, that the Thornes were not just poor but desperate. That there are other debts, personal ones. Clara gripped the banister, her heart hammering. She fled down the corridor before she could hear Julian's reply, the poison of Isabella's words seeping into her chest. The next morning, the sky over Pencarrow was the color of a bruise, heavy with the promise of a violent storm. The air pressure was so low it made Clara's head ache. She spent the morning in the village, delivering baskets of food to the tenant families who were bracing for the weather. When she returned to the castle, muddy and windblown, she found the atmosphere in the great hall had shifted from tense to suffocating. Julian was waiting for her. He stood by the fireplace, his back rigid. In his hand, he held a piece of paper. Lady Isabella was seated on the velvet settee nearby, examining her fingernails with an air of bored triumph. Julian! Clara untied her bonnet, her fingers numb from the cold. Is something wrong? The barometer is dropping fast. I think we should. Where did you go this morning? Julian's voice cracked through the room like a whip. Clara froze. I went to the village. To Mrs. Gurney's. And before that... He turned to face her. His eyes were dark, devoid of the warmth she had seen just yesterday. They were the eyes of the stranger she had married. Did you stop at the post house? Yes, Clara stammered, confused. I had a letter to send. To whom? It is private, Julian. A family matter. Julian laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He strode forward and thrust the paper he was holding toward her. It was not her letter but a page torn from the estate ledger, the very ledger she had been working on. Isabella found this on your desk, he said. She was looking for writing paper, she claims. What she found was a discrepancy. £500, Clara, drafted from the estate accounts yesterday. And this morning, the postmaster confirms you sent a bank draft to London. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. I can explain. Can you? Julian stepped closer, towering over her. Isabella tells me there is a man in London. A Mr. H. She says he has been writing to you. Mr. Harding is a solicitor. Clara cried, looking from Julian to the smirking Isabella. He represents my father's remaining creditors. There was one debt left, a gambling debt my father was too ashamed to list in the settlement. If it isn't paid, they will take my mother's home. I borrowed the money from the estate. I intended to pay it back from my pin money over time. I only listed it as sundries because I didn't want to shame my family further. A secret debt, Julian repeated slowly. To a man I do not know. Hidden in my own ledgers. I was protecting them. You are protecting yourself. Julian roared, the hurt finally breaking through his anger. I thought you were different. I thought you were the one honest thing in this nest of vipers. But you are just like them. You manipulate. You hide. You steal. I did not steal. Clara stepped forward, grabbing the lapels of his coat. Julian, look at me. I am your wife. I have worked my fingers to the bone for this house. For you. Do you truly believe I am a thief? Do you trust her word over mine? He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers. For a second, she saw the conflict, the desperate desire to believe her warring with a lifetime of betrayal. Then, he looked at Isabella, who offered him a sad, knowing smile. The doubt, planted in fertile soil, took root. Julian pulled Clara's hands from his coat and stepped back. The physical distance felt like a chasm opening between them. I trust no one, he said, his voice dead. I see that now. You may keep the money, Clara. Consider it payment for your services as a housekeeper. But do not expect me to play the fool any longer. Julian, please. Get out of my sight, he whispered. Before I say something I cannot revoke. Clara stood trembling, the tears finally spilling over. She looked at the man she had fallen in love with on a balcony, the man who was hurting so deeply he would rather destroy his own happiness than risk being fooled again. She turned and ran from the room, the sound of her sobbing lost in the rising howl of the wind outside. By late afternoon, the storm had hit with full fury. Rain lashed against the stone walls of Pencaro like shrapnel. The sky was pitch black, though it was only 3 o'clock. Julian sat in his study, a bottle of brandy half empty on the desk. He felt sick. The victory over the thief felt like ash in his mouth. He kept seeing Clara's face, the genuine terror of a mother's home. The hurt when he accused her. Mr. Harding is a solicitor. You were rather hard on her, darling, Isabella said, drifting into the room with a glass of wine. Though necessary, of course. One must discipline the help. She is not the help, Julian snapped, not looking up. Oh, come now. She's a little drab thing who tricked you. Once the old Duke dies, you can annul it, or install her in a dower house and forget she exists. We can go back to London, to the life you were meant for. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Julian looked at it, the perfectly manicured nails, the lack of calluses. He thought of Clara's hands, stained with ink and garden soil. He thought of Clara visiting the tenants in the freezing rain. Isabella found this on your desk. Julian frowned. The ledger had been locked in his desk drawer. He had the only key. Or he did, until he gave a spare to Clara. How did you find the ledger, Isabella? Julian asked slowly. It was locked. Isabella froze. Was it? I believe it was left open on the table. Clara never leaves the books open. She is meticulous. Julian stood up, the fog of brandy clearing instantly. And how did you know about Mr. Harding? Clara never mentioned his name. The entry in the book only said sundries. Isabella's smile faltered. Well, one hears rumors in London. Mr. Harding is a small-time debt collector in Cheapside. The Ton does not gossip about him. Julian advanced on her. You went through her correspondence. You broke into her desk. I did it for you. Isabella cried, her mask shattering. To show you what she is. She is a nobody, Julian. She is using you. She was saving her mother, Julian said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. She told the truth. And I. He looked at the window. The storm was raging, shaking the very foundations of the castle. Where is she? Julian demanded. Where's Clara? I don't know, Isabella sniffed. I saw her run out toward the stables an hour ago. Something about the shepherd's hut on the cliffs. Foolish girl, going out in this. The cliffs. Julian's blood turned to ice. The shepherd's hut was on the most exposed point of the headland. In this wind, the path would be a death trap. Get out, Julian snarled at Isabella, grabbing his heavy coat from the rack. Julian, you can't go out there. It's a hurricane. I said, get out. Get out of my house. Get out of my life. He didn't wait for her answer. He sprinted into the hallway, shouting for the stable master. The cynicism was gone, burned away by a terror he had never known. He hadn't just misjudged Clara. He had sent her into the storm. And if he didn't find her, the silence in Pencaro Castle would be permanent. The world had dissolved into chaos. Julian rode his black stallion, Onyx, through a landscape that had ceased to look like Cornwall and now resembled the end of days. The wind screamed off the Atlantic, a physical force that threatened to tear him from the saddle. Rain lashed against his face like icy needles, blinding him, soaking him to the skin in seconds. "Clara!" he roared, but the wind swallowed his voice instantly. He urged Onyx forward, fighting the horse's terror with his own desperation. The path to the shepherd's hut was treacherous on a sunny day. In this tempest, it was a ribbon of mud clinging to the edge of a sheer drop. Below, the ocean crashed against the cliffs with a sound like cannon fire, sending plumes of spray high into the black air. "I sent her here," the thought looped in his mind, a sickening mantra. "My cynicism, my pride. I sent her into this." He remembered the look on her face when he accused her of stealing. It wasn't just fear. It was heartbreak. She had looked at him as if he were the only person in the world who could hurt her, because he was the only one she had let in. And he had used that trust to strike her down. A flicker of light cut through the gloom ahead. Julian squinted against the rain. It was a lantern, swinging wildly in the gale. The shepherd's hut stood on the promontory, a small stone structure that looked pitifully fragile against the might of the storm. And there, struggling with the latch of the door, was a figure in a soaked gray cloak. Clara! She didn't hear him. She was wrestling with the wooden door, which was banging violently against the stone frame, threatening to tear off its hinges. As Julian watched, a gust of wind stronger than the rest slammed into her. Clara lost her footing. She slipped in the mud, sliding dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. "No!" Julian threw himself from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He hit the mud and scrambled forward, his boots finding purchase in the slick grass. Clara was clawing at the earth, trying to arrest her slide, but the mud was unforgiving. Her legs dangled over the precipice, the white surf churning hundreds of feet below. "Julian!" she screamed, her voice thin with terror. He reached her just as her fingers began to slip. He grabbed her wrist, his grip iron hard. With a roar of exertion, he hauled her up, dragging her body over the lip of the cliff and onto the solid earth. He didn't stop there. He pulled her further back, rolling them both away from the edge until they hit the stone wall of the hut. He pinned her there, shielding her body with his own as the wind howled around them. He was gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You foolish, foolish woman," he choked out, grabbing her face in his hands. His thumbs wiped away the mud and rain from her cheeks. "What were you doing? Why did you come here?" Clara was shaking violently, her teeth chattering. The roof. Old Shepherd Tom, his bedridden. "The roof leaks. I came to bring a torp and check on him." Julian looked at the hut. Inside, he could see the dim outline of the old shepherd huddled in the corner. She hadn't run away to sulk. She hadn't run away to escape him. She had come out into a hurricane to save an old man because she believed it was her duty. Even when he had broken her heart, she was still thinking of others. The shame that washed over him was hotter than the cold rain. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her wet hair. "I have you," he whispered fiercely into her ear. "I have you, Clara. I'm never letting you go." They rode back to the castle huddled together on Onyx, moving slowly through the storm. When they finally clattered into the courtyard, the entire household was waiting with lanterns. Julian slid down and pulled Clara into his arms, carrying her through the main doors. He ignored the gasps of the maids and the wide eyes of the footmen. He ignored everything but the shivering weight of his wife in his arms. "Hot water," he barked at Mrs. Pendergast. "Blankets. Brandy. Now." He carried her up the grand staircase, not to her room in the guest wing, but to his own chambers, the master suite that no duchess had occupied in 20 years. He kicked the door shut and set her down on the rug before the roaring fire. He stripped off her sodden cloak and wrapped her in the thick fur throw from his bed. She was pale, her lips blue, and her eyes huge and traumatized. Julian knelt before her, chafing her frozen hands between his. "Isabella," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Is she?" She is gone, Julian said, his voice hard. I told the carriage driver to take her to the village inn. She will be on the first coach to London tomorrow. She will never set foot in Cornwall again. Clara looked at him, searching his face. But the ledger, the money. You said. I was a fool. Julian cut her off. He looked down at her hands, red, raw, and trembling. He lifted them to his lips, kissing the knuckles, then the palms, then the wrists. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I saw a thief because I was terrified of seeing the truth. The truth. That I had fallen in love with you, he confessed, the words tearing out of him. From the moment I saw you on that balcony, mending a dress for a girl who didn't deserve your kindness. You terrified me, Clara. You were so real, so good. I didn't know what to do with you. I have spent my life guarding my heart against people who only want my title. I couldn't believe anyone would want me. He looked up at her, his dark eyes shining with unshed tears. I accused you to protect myself, he said brokenly. I thought if I pushed you away, if I made you the villain, it wouldn't hurt so much when you eventually disappointed me. But you never did. You saved my home. You saved my people. And today, when I thought you had gone over that cliff, he shuddered, gripping her tighter. I realized that if you fell, I would fall with you. I cannot exist in a world where you are not. Clara stared at him. The cold barrier of the Duke's heir was gone. The man kneeling before her was stripped bare, offering her everything he had. I didn't marry you for the money, she whispered, freeing a hand to touch his wet cheek. I married you to save my parents, yes. But I stayed. I worked. I tried, because I loved you. Julian froze. You loved me, even when I was a monster. I saw the man beneath the armor, she said softly. Just as I told you on the balcony. You were lonely, and I hoped, that perhaps I could be the one to make you less lonely. Julian let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He leaned forward, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of rain, brandy, and salvation. It was desperate and tender, a promise sealed in the firelight. You have, he murmured against her mouth. You have. The storm broke just before dawn. Julian and Clara lay entangled in the massive four-poster bed, watching the gray light filter through the curtains. The silence of the castle was peaceful now, no longer oppressive. A soft knock came at the door. Julian rose, pulling on a dressing gown, and opened it to find Mrs. Pendergast. Her face was grave. My lord, she said quietly. It is the Duke. Julian nodded. He knew. He held out his hand to Clara. She took it without hesitation. Together, they walked down the corridor to the Duke's chambers. The old man was lying propped up on pillows, his breathing shallow and rattling. He looked small in the great bed, the formidable tyrant reduced to bone and shadow. But when Julian and Clara entered, his eyes opened. They were clear. He looked at Julian, then at Clara. He saw their clasped hands. He saw the way Julian angled his body to protect her and the way she leaned into him for strength. A faint, ghostly smile touched the Duke's lips. So, the old man rasped. The wolf is tamed. Not tamed, grandfather, Julian said, squeezing Clara's hand. Partnered. The Duke shifted his gaze to Clara. The accounts, he wheezed. The discrepancies. There are no discrepancies, Your Grace, Julian said firmly. Only investments in the future of this family. The Duke nodded slowly. He closed his eyes. Good, he whispered. The line is secure. He died an hour later, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the rugged coast in golden light. Epilogue, 6 months later. Spring in Cornwall was a revelation. The cliffs, so recently battered by storms, were now carpeted in sea thrift and wild campion, a riot of pink and white against the turquoise sea. Julian stood on the balcony of Pencarrow Castle, the same balcony where he used to brood in isolation. Now, the stone was warm under his hand. There you are, a voice called. He turned to see Clara stepping through the doors. She looked radiant. Her hair was loose, caught only by a ribbon, and her dress was a soft yellow that matched the gorse blooming on the moors. She was no longer the invisible wallflower of London, nor the frightened bride of winter. She was the Duchess of Cornwall and every inch the mistress of her domain. I was looking for you, Julian said, reaching for her. I have something for you. Oh, is it another horse? Because I really do not think the stables can hold another of your impulse purchases. Not a horse. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Clara raised an eyebrow. Jewels, Julian, you know I have enough. Open it. She clicked the latch. Inside sat a simple silver thimble. Clara laughed, a bright, joyous sound that carried on the breeze. A thimble. I met you when you were mending a dress, Julian said, taking the thimble and placing it gently in her palm. You were fixing the world, one stitch at a time. I wanted you to have this, a reminder. A reminder of what? That you mended me, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that still made her shiver. I was torn, Clara, ragged and useless, and you stitched me back together. Clara's eyes softened. She stepped into his space, wrapping her arms around his waist. You were never useless, my love. You just needed someone to point out that the gray storm clouds eventually pass. And bring the sun, he finished, leaning down to kiss her. Below them, on the lawn, the tenants were gathering for the May Day festival. The castle was full of noise and life. The ledgers were balanced. The debts were paid. And the Duke of Cornwall, once the loneliest man in England, held his world in his arms, knowing that the greatest fortune he possessed wasn't the title, or the land, or the gold in the vaults. It was the woman he had seen in the shadows of a ball, who had dared to step into the light and drag him with her. Come, Clara said, pulling back with a mischievous smile. Mrs. Pendergast has bet the new footman that you won't dance around the maypole. I have £50 riding on the fact that you will. Julian groaned, but he let her pull him toward the door. £50. You are gambling with the estate money again, Duchess. I am investing in morale, she countered. Very well, Julian laughed, following her into the light. Lead on, wife. I will follow you anywhere.